Thank you so much for joining us today this is actually our first webinar we're hosting, so thank you so much.
Oh, good luck.
My name's Emma, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Defense Initiative. We're also known as TEDI for short.
I'm Kailey, and I'm the networking coordinator for TEDI.
My name is Eric Freedman. I am a professor of journalism and director of the Knight Center for Environmental Journalism at Michigan State University.
So our first question is just a little bit about your career. So what exactly do you do as an environmental journalist, and on a day-to-day basis, what does your workday look like?
I do several things. I do some reporting on my own. I do a lot of editing of student stories, some of which are posted on our regional environmental news website, greatlakesecho.org. Others that have a Michigan focus, we distribute to more than 40 news organizations around the state, newspapers, online news services, and some specialized publications. In terms of my own reporting, I have the luxury of being able to write about what I want. And environment is huge. So it's pollution and toxic waste. It's extreme weather. It's climate. It's energy, transportation, agriculture, natural resources, extractive industries, a whole giant portfolio. And I like to write about issues relating to biodiversity and extinction, use of public resources, natural resources like public land, rivers. We're in the Great Lakes region, so we have the world's largest supply of fresh water in the region. I sometimes write about environmental litigation, court lawsuits involving environmental crimes, or civil suits to force the cleanup of toxic waste sites. My students are more likely to write collectively about more of the things than I do on my own.
Yeah, that's really awesome, really cool. Do you write about a lot of stuff that's like local to your area, or do you focus on more like global environmental issues?
Most of what I do at the university relates to environment in the Great Lakes region. Great Lakes Basin, part of all of 8 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So in New York, along the St. Lawrence River to the north of you, and parts of the Adirondack in the western part of the state where you have Lake Ontario, that's part of the Great Lakes Basin. And then I do some freelance magazine writing on environmental issues, and that focuses more globally. And wildlife illegal trafficking, biodiversity, written about roadkill and how roadkill is used for scientific research. I have this. Well, let me explain it this way. When I talk about covering the environment, and you say that somebody, particularly my students, or just ordinary readers or viewers or listeners to our podcasts, climate change, and their eyes glaze over. It's just too big. It's like saying, we're going to write about war, or we're going to write about poverty. So I look for stories that are not the mountain, but they're the grains of sand and the pebbles that our audience can relate to. So in my region, winters are getting warmer. There's an annual ice fishing competition north of here in northern Michigan for the sturgeon. The sturgeon's a huge fish. It goes back to prehistoric times, and there's a limit of about 6 a year that can be legally fished from Black Lake. This year, there wasn't enough ice, so the event was canceled. If you live along the shores of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Superior, you'll see the fluctuation of the levels of the lake. And you can visualize that because you'd go to a state park and the beach is either way out there or the beach is way back here. You talk about toxic chemicals in landfills. Well, is your water system in your city or your town contaminated with lead or with microplastics? So it's finding the stories that people can visualize and make this broader issue of environment more real to them, more tangible, and they're more likely to pay attention.
Yeah, that's awesome. That definitely resonates with us because a big part of what we do is a lot of writing articles and blogs to post on our platforms about environmental issues. I think we did recently just post a blog about microplastic pollution. We also have a petition out right now about microplastic pollution. So the work you're doing is definitely very important, and very interesting to hear about. Um, you were talking about how you are trying to find like the more interesting stories to kind of get the public to relate to what you're writing about. Is that mostly stuff that you pick up on in your community, or do people like give you these stories and you have to find a way to incorporate them into writing? How does that process kind of work?
Oh, the ideas come from a variety of sources. I look at a lot of academic scientific studies,
Mhm.
and I go into Web of Science, which is a database, and I have a couple of search terms, including Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River. I go in every week or two. I see what's been published. Much of it, I have no idea what it means. I'm not a scientist. And when it's too technical, I'm just not going to deal with that. Some of my students might. But is there a story that we can tell based on the research that then resonates with an audience? Usually these studies are read only by other scientists.
Mm.
They're not read by policymakers. They're not read by ordinary people and ordinary activists. So as journalists, if we can tell those stories and use the science, then that's a source of ideas. We get press releases from federal and state agencies. So it could be the US Forest Service, could be the National Park Service, the Environmental Protection Agency,
Mm.
could be from a state agency, like you have a Department of Environmental Conservation. And there'll be press releases, there'll be data, there'll be reports issued. Advocacy groups, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, grassroots organizations reach out to news media and say, we're doing something, might be interesting, or we're upset about something, or we're proud about something. And then we decide whether we think it's a story that our audiences will care about or read. Other source comes in, you're just reading other news media. So I spend a lot of time in front of the computer, as I think we all do, and I look at some aggregators of scientific news and public policy news from around the country. And if there's a controversy, environmental controversy in Idaho over closing abandoned mines, I might say to one of my students, why don't you look at, is Michigan having a problem with pollution or dangerous conditions at abandoned iron mines in the northern part of the state?
Mm.
So if it's happening someplace else, could it be happening here? And if it's happening here, that might be a story. But we swim in an ocean of ideas, and no matter how many of us there are and how long we live, we can never tell all those stories.
Definitely. That's really nice to hear. Um, do you have any, do you know of any like helpful skills or traits to have when pursuing like a career in environmental journalism? Obviously, writing would be a big one, but are there any other characteristics that are good for people who want to go into this field?
Some of the professional skills that you would use if you were covering business or education or sports, not just environment, ability, not just to write, but to interview, to do research, to organize all your stuff, all the information you have, to assess, is it sound logical? Does it sound credible? So all those are journalistic skills, communication skills. You don't need to be a scientist, but you have to be able to ask questions of scientists. We don't like to sound stupid. Interviewing a biochemist or wildlife biologist, I tell students, don't pretend to know what you don't know. If the scientist is talking to you in jargon, like an economist might, or a hockey geek might, you need to be able to say, what would I tell my great Aunt Martha at the dinner table on Sunday? When she says, what have you been doing, dearie? And you're talking about PCBs and PFAS and microfibers.
Yeah.
So you can't be too proud to ask them to explain it, sometimes to re-explain it. You also have to be time conscious, because journalism is a competitive industry. So you're not the only person in the world who's going to get a press release. You're not the only one who's going to look on the EPA website and see that there's a new style on areas of concern on the St. Lawrence River. So you need time management as another skill. And you have to be curious. You can't be a journalist without being curious, nosy. Sometimes you ask questions that might be embarrassing. Well, why did you get a $15 million grant and the research didn't prove anything? How come your study that coffee is good for you conflicts with all these other studies that say coffee is bad for you? No, I think coffee is good for you, but not for everybody. And if you're pregnant or allergic to caffeine, then it's not going to be good to you. And then the other thing is that you have to know when not to argue or fight. And in our area, let me give you two. The climate change deniers. The vast majority of scientists, particularly those who deal with environment or meteorology or natural resources or forestry, they know that there is irrefutable scientific evidence that human behavior contributes to climate change. Not saying that it's the sole source of it, and not saying that anything and everything people could do will reverse or at least stop that trend. But there are people out there who believe, or at least they argue, that climate change is garbage and it happens in these ice ages and that's the way of life. Fluoridation. The vast majority of public health experts, dental health experts, know that fluoride in your water is good for your teeth, and that if you live in a community that doesn't fluoridate its water, the odds are that your kids are going to have poorer dental health than the people in the next city over who fluoridate water. And the anti-vaccine movement, which we saw before COVID, escalated during COVID, and is continuing, the skepticism about science. So as a journalist, your job is not to get into an argument with these people if you have to interview them, but you still have to be realistic in what you're reporting. And if things are absurd, they don't go in the story unless the article's about climate deniers or the anti-vax movement. So I think most environmental journalists wouldn't necessarily call themselves environmentalists. They're not advocates as such, but they have an understanding and a respect for the science of environment. And they have the ability to tell those stories to listeners, to viewers, to readers.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Those are very good points.
Yeah, so just based on past experiences, like where can you remember that your passion for the environment really started?
Oh, yeah, that's not a question I can answer. And I didn't grow up outdoors. I grew up in a suburb. I rode my bike a lot, so I went outside. And I've lived in big cities, so it gives you a respect for what's not there. Yeah, I lived in New York City. I lived in Washington. I grew up outside Boston. So it developed gradually, and then my professional interest evolved from my coverage of public affairs more broadly. I was one of the areas I was interested in was environment, but it wasn't the only one. But I found the stories interesting, and being an environmental reporter gives you a great reason not to be sitting in front of your computer all day. You should be out there. You should be on the scene. You should be visiting the scientists in the lab and the researchers who are out in the woods, be talking to people in communities with that have been plagued by environmental injustice, landfills, urban pollution, factories, brownfields, and it gives you a valid reason to get out away from your desk, away from your bosses, and see things. You can describe things in words. You can take pictures. You can't take pictures just sitting at the terminal. You can't shoot video just sitting at the terminal.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that speaks well to like the variety of people that are in this field and all the different experiences that we all have. And I know you touched on this a little bit, but like when did you really decide that you wanted to pursue a career in environmental journalism?
Oh, I think I just evolved into it. It's not the only journalism I do, but it's a major component of it.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned that you've gotten the opportunity to conduct research in multiple different countries. Like, what countries have you done research in, and what kinds of research projects have you been able to do?
And talking in the environmental area, I've done a lot in the former Soviet Union. I taught for a semester in Uzbekistan. I taught for a semester in the Republic of Georgia in the Caucasus. Taught for a semester in Lithuania in the Baltics. So I've done more academic research into how journalists in those countries cover environmental issues or don't cover them. Some of them, like Uzbekistan and elsewhere in Central Asia, have highly constrained media. There's little or no press freedom. News organizations, independent ones, are discouraged or in some countries prohibited. And environmental issues cause a lot of problems for the public, but there are a lot of powerful economic and political players. So one of the areas I do research in is obstacles and perils and dangers that environmental journalists encounter. So I interview journalists. So I'll give you a couple of examples. A few months ago, for a project, I interviewed a journalist who covers the mining industry in Kazakhstan in Central Asia. And she had gone to cover a mining disaster where more than 200 miners were initially trapped underground. They were rescued, but 5 miners died. And when she got to the site, not only did people not want to talk to her, they kicking her out, they grabbed her phone, and she was assaulted by the security guards. Another Peruvian journalist I interviewed writes a lot about problems in the Amazon. And he'd been attacked and harassed. He'd been threatened with a machete. I've had others who were arrested, prosecuted, jailed. A Liberian journalist, independent journalist, spent 6 months in his country's most notorious prison for writing about corruption in an agriculture-related environmental story. So that's another area of my research. And then, but I also use those travels to write for non-academic audiences. So when I was in Uzbekistan, I visited the Aral Sea, or what's left of the Aral Sea. And it had mostly dried up because in Soviet times, most of the water that replenished the sea was diverted to irrigation for cotton and wheat, which are not things you would grow in the desert, but Soviet central planners did that. So I did a couple of magazine pieces on that, on extinction. I visited some sites in Tasmania and Uzbekistan where species went extinct. I saw the last passenger pigeon in the world, which is stuffed in a storage bin at the Smithsonian, named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in the early 1900s. And it makes it tangible. The academic research is important, but what the research can teach you to teach the public is satisfying and important.
Yeah, 100%. It's very important for us to shed the light on the people that are doing the hard work, and also to make sure that it gets translated to people, to everyday public people.
I also just wanted to ask you one quick follow-up question. You said like you've done a lot of research in those countries. How much of your job is like researching and interviewing, and how much is the actual writing piece? Like, what would you say you do more of?
Mm. Well, the interviewing takes longer.
Mhm.
Partly it's logistics, setting it up. It's not as hard now with Zoom as it is if you're traveling around the country or even within the US. But my writing style is not have a giant pile of notes and then sit there for hours and hours. I write in pieces. It's just the way I've done things. So I work on bits and pieces as I go along, and I put in material from a new interview, and I take things out and I rearrange. So the interviewing and the research, the reading of the studies, all that takes time. But the writing, if I added up the time, would be substantial because a lot of it is rewriting.
Mm.
And we all hate rewriting. And we all hate editors telling us we should rewrite, let alone deciding on our own. And you know that from your own experience. You're doing a term paper or an essay or a poem, and well, it doesn't quite sound right. But there's no right way or wrong way to write these stories. I have, this is a study I just pulled off of Web of Science. It's about a survey done in Michigan about the well-being of nurses in the state. And are they stressed out, and what are they prone to psychological problems or self-harm? So I'll go through this fairly quickly with a highlighter, and I'll jot notes on it, and I'll underline certain things that I think will go in the story. And then I'll look at it again, but I'll do an interview with at least one of the authors, probably call somebody from one of the nursing associations or another expert. So it's all a process. When I'm done reading this the first time, I could sit down and bang out a story.
Mhm.
It won't be as full as it could become, but if a boss handed me this and said, you have 2 hours till deadline, I would get something done within 2 hours.
Mhm.
And I guess another piece of it is, do you have somebody else other than an editor look at it? And it might be another reporter in your newsroom. I don't, and journalists don't show stories to the people they interview until the story is published or posted or broadcast. Although we sometimes will read back to them or send them an email with some data or statistics or something we didn't quite understand, see if we've explained it right. And we'll sometimes follow up, talk to somebody who's on one side of the issue, and talk to somebody on the opposite side. Then you may go back to the first person and say, well, the second person said your organization data is wrong. How do you respond? So there's a give and take. It's not just the interviewer talking to the interviewee, but the interviewer kind of in the middle of the transaction.
Yeah, it's very cool to hear about it because it's definitely a very intricate process. So thank you for like explaining it a little bit to us.
Let me throw something out to you that we do at the Knight Center here.
Mhm.
We've been giving some grants to high schools in Michigan, public and non-public, for collaborative projects between their journalism classes and their environmental science or biological science
Mhm.
classes. And the idea is that you're in the science class and maybe you're doing water testing. And is the creek or the stream near the school or the wetlands contaminated? And then the reporters go out while the science students are doing their stuff with the bottles and vials and labeling and all that. And they might shoot photos, shoot video, and they do something for the school newspaper or the class website, or the school might have a website. And it's a way that exposes the future journalists or people who want to be communicators to seeing science done in the field while they're in high school. And it's less intimidating, I think, for the students to do it when it's biology class at the school than professionals going out from an environmental organization and maybe doing the same kind of testing. So we give small grants that help them buy equipment, or they can give scholarships and all, but teachers can do that on their own within your school.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I know a lot of the members of our team are a part of like research programs at our high schools too. So it's really great to hear that like schools like Michigan State are doing stuff like that. And like on the topic of like high school advocacy, what kind of stuff did you do anything related to environmental journalism in high school, or do you know how students who are in high school right now could do more to get involved at a younger age?
Well, when I was in high school, which was quite a while ago, we didn't think or talk about environment. We talked maybe a little bit about conservation, but
Mhm.
that was about it. And biology class didn't deal with issues. It dealt with dissecting animals and understanding impact of rain on plants, those kinds of really sciency, non-policy kind of things.
Mhm.
But now high school students are much more environmentally aware, and curricula in high schools becomes more than just the hard science part of science, but the policy, the economics, the implications in a way that didn't exist then. Second part of your question about how students get involved, aside from classes, some of it is the fairly obvious. They have recycling, they take the initiative there. Uh, if their school is near a wetlands area, then they might go out and do some kind of advocacy. If the school district is thinking of building an addition to the gym, is that going to encroach on the green space or on the environment there? Is the school district switching to buses that run on natural gas or electric? So there are those things that within their communities and in and out of school that they can do. They can go to public events. They can join organizations, including community grassroots organizations. You guys live in the Hudson Valley.
Mhm.
So Hudson Valley has a long tradition of environmental activism. Pete Seeger and the Hudson River, but you have agriculture, you have vineyards and wineries. You have recreation, outdoor recreation. You have public lands. And there are a lot of state parks around the country and national parks have friends of the XYZ state park. And they're volunteers who may go out several times a year and clean the beaches or help maintain the trails. So there are those kinds of things that get you out of the school setting and into the communities.
Yeah, we definitely believe in that kind of stuff because it there's always like large scale efforts through like schools and universities and like public organizations, but I think it also is very important to get people involved like on a smaller scale, like even if they're just doing a cleanup or signing a petition. I think like every little thing counts, and it can prepare them for becoming even more involved in the future too. So I definitely appreciate that feedback.
Some people feel constrained, like, what can I do? Turning out the light when I leave the room, yeah, that's not going to do anything to energy crisis or climate change. But I give the example of Girl Scout cookies, right? You buy a box of Girl Scout cookies, preferably Samoas or Thin Mints, but whatever your preference is, and you pay $6. Well, $6, half that's going to go to the company that bakes them, and $3 maybe will go to the troop there and say, well, what can you do on $3? Can't send a girl to scout camp for a week. You can't rent a bus for a field trip, but those $3 all add up. And you may not be able to take 10 boxes of cookies worth to raise $30, but you can buy one box of cookies and $3 becomes added to everybody else's $3 and $6 and $9. And if you think of it that way, no individual is going to go out and save the white rhino.
Yeah.
Or prevent the logging of rainforests to grow, to raise beef for McDonald's hamburgers. But you can contribute in your own way and feel like you've accomplished something.
Yeah, I really like those analogies. They're really impactful.
Yeah, good. Well, it was great talking to both of you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you so much.